When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblin YouTube channel. Today's video, by the title you guys can see, this is also an extra video because I really wanted to do this video this week. I've been doing a series looking at Order of the Green Hands Ned and Ashara theory. And I feel like in that theory, I haven't really been able to explain why I believe Rhaegar and Lyanna. A lot of the times, it's just me contradicting their points because they don't bring up a lot of the counter examples for R+L. They just kind of, unless they get into that in future installments, the first two parts of the first, and their like video length is like the first 40 minutes. They haven't really talked about any R+L evidence. They've only talked about Ned and Ashara. So I am going to try my best in this video. I hope I don't remake this video in the future because I know I've made an Ned and Ashara video in depth. I've made a Rhaegar and Lyanna video. I think I've done that like twice now. So this is going to be kind of the culmination of both theories. I'm going to talk about both theories and why I am a R+L guy. I think for a lot of you, that especially people that are in my live streams or rewatch those, know I am more of a common, like, theorist kind of guy. Usually when they start getting really magical or they get really complex, I kind of tend to take a step back because logically, for me, I think you have to make more things fit for that theory to work. And in this theory, we're going to go with R+L versus N+A. Now, I'm going to start the video talking about N+A because I think it's important to talk about the counter-arguments to my theory before I get into my own evidence. So for you guys that have been watching my Order of the Green Hand reaction series, this is stuff you guys are probably going to heard already. So I will have some timestamps in the bottom, in the top pinned comment, and in the description of when I start both the N+A arguments and my own R+L. So if you wanted to skip around, you can do that. But before we get into this video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment for more of this type of content, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach our people that might like this content as well, and let's get into it. So let's start with N+A. So I want to start off with, so N+A, there are a couple main sources of information that people that believe in this theory will go to. And my first big thing here, before I start dissecting all of the different quotes that they have, I want to straight up point out, all of these sources are very unreliable. Let's look at our major sources. So Catelyn is, for Game of Thrones, the first major source. She has two big quotes that involve Ashara. And the first one revolves around this idea that Catelyn, when she is first coming to Winterfell, she hears, probably through her, like her handmaidens, her people that are, you know, her women that serve her, that they probably heard from Ned's men-at-arms that Ashara and Ned had a relationship, and that is who Jon's mother was. So then Catelyn is kind of asking about this idea of, you know, is Ashara Jon's mother and all of that. That's more or less what she's necessarily asking. And she notes that this is the first time she really saw Ned angry, to where it kind of scared her. And people will quote, especially N+A people, that this is because Ned really loved Ashara. He loved her to the point that maybe they got married and he maybe annulled it, or that he had a kid with her, or he had a really deep feelings for her. And something I'm not going to argue in this video is that I think Ned did have feelings for Ashara. That's evident at Harrenhal when he's trying to dance with her, but he's too nervous. There's a lot of things that do point to the idea that Ned at least had a crush on her, and maybe they had some kind of relationship, but I don't think it's to the degree that people think it is. So there's this idea, right? So Catelyn then asks, you know, of that idea, and Ned responds that Jon is my blood and that's all you need to know. This is important because we're going to look at another piece of evidence on the N+A side that they say, because Ned says in Bran 1, when Jon and Robb, they're racing, they find the wolves, Ned specifically says, what trouble have my sons basically found now, or gotten into now? And people will say, well, he says sons. That's very important. That must mean that Jon is actually the son of Ned. But let's think about this from a public sense. Ned has been propping up this lie, for me it's a lie, that Ned is his son for so long, and Ned has raised Jon like his own. Of course he's going to call him a son, especially publicly. It looks really weird if he doesn't. But then, when we get to a private moment with Catelyn, and again, this is what's very key to remember here. This is very early on in the relationship where Ned is still very new to the lie he's trying to tell. And when will you slip up more in your lies? Publicly, when you know it's important, or privately with, say, Catelyn? And in this moment, when Catelyn asks about Ashara, Ned says specifically that Jon is his blood, not that Jon is his son. It's very different. Usually when people are referring to blood, they're talking about maybe an uncle, maybe a cousin, a sister, maybe a brother. Not really a son. That's a little different. So again, that's something that I will point to where N+A, a lot of the times it contradicts itself. Some of the main arguments tend to contradict themselves because that argument there that they're trying to say that Ned calls him a son, well, in this other moment, privately, and also given more context, very, like, right when Ned's kind of coming back to Winterfell in those early days, isn't telling the lie good enough. So, or I guess telling the truth, because in that regard, he would be saying that Jon is his son. So again, I think for that first Catelyn quote, you can pretty much just throw it out the window right then and there. I think the only thing you can really take away from that, if you're N+A, is that Ned did probably have some sort of feeling for Ashara. There's a lot of things that are culminating in Ned right now when she asks that question. The first thing would be, one, Ned doesn't want questions being raised about Jon or anything around the idea of who Jon's mother was or anything on that idea because it's a very dangerous topic. If that was to get out, that would be dire for Jon. And that's the thing I'm going to talk about when we get the R+L points, but that's the first major Catelyn quote we get. So the second one is basically Catelyn thinks about who, again, Jon's mother was, and she thinks about Ashara. And again, there's not much kind of here that really wasn't talked about in the first quote, because again, it's Catelyn going off of rumors that she hears. Catelyn is not a primary source in this. She's basically taking in rumors. So again, I don't think that's great evidence as to suggest that Ashara is Jon's mother. So the next one we get is from Cersei. Now, Cersei, this is the thing about a lot of this theory, is that you have to kind of pick and choose what to believe. So Cersei is basically trying to make Ned angry, and she basically goes with saying, oh, did you sleep with a camp follower? Was it a wet nurse? Or was it Ashara or a whore or something like that? So Cersei, even in her own mind, doesn't know who Ned slept with. She's going off of all of the rumors that she's heard. She doesn't specifically just say Ashara. And that's what's interesting. Something I didn't even catch when I was reacting to the Order of the Green Hand when they brought that quote up is that Cersei doesn't imply just Ashara. She implies a couple different ideas there. And you have to choose which part of that story you believe when even Cersei herself is not a primary source and isn't even concrete on who she even believes Ned slept with. So again, let's even look at that quote even further. Ned at this point, after that happens, he basically says the whole thing where you should get your children away, you should leave. But he's still very resolute. He's not really, he does seem like a little bit more stern, a little bit maybe more angry, but not a big emotional thing after hearing Ashara's name. But what happens later in that chapter, or even in that chapter as a whole, when Cersei brings up that on their first night with Robert, or her first night with Robert, when they were sleeping with each other, Robert whispered in her ear, Lyanna. And what kind of response does that get from Ned? Ned starts to almost weep. He thinks about weeping in this moment. That's something I'm going to bring up for R+L later on, but you can obviously tell there's much more going on with the idea of Lyanna and how Ned feels about that. So again, that's something that I really just don't put too much credibility into with the Cersei idea. It's just, again, Cersei spouting off rumors that she has heard. And she spouts out multiple rumors, not just Ashara. So the next idea that we hear is in A Storm of Swords. So again, she's not mentioned in A Clash at all. There's not a single reference to Ashara in an entire book. So then we get to A Storm of Swords, and we get this idea that, or Ned Dane, gets this idea that he does believe that Ned and Ashara fell in love at Harrenhal. They'd had this dance and they fell in love. But what's something that's interesting that Order of the Green Hand also kind of left out of their theory that I thought was interesting, that this is something that, again, I didn't really remember, is that Ned Dane doesn't actually think it was Ashara that was the mother. Ned Dane believes that it was Wyla, this wet nurse that would have probably been at the Tower of Joy, was who Ned slept with. So, interesting to note that even Ned Dane doesn't believe that Ashara was the mother of Jon. So again, we have another idea where Ashara is brought up, but again, she's not even the person that Ned Dane is saying is the mother. So you have to, again, pick and choose what evidence to believe in that story. Again, another secondary source. It's not a primary source of someone that would have been there. Again, more kind of rumors and such. And also, I've made the idea that why would they be telling Ned Dane the story? Probably to try and save some of Ashara's honor. Again, the rumors are not good. Cersei straight up says what the rumor is, that Ashara was basically Ned's whore, and then he left her. So again, not great. Also, you look at this idea that why was Ned Dane, that's another evidence that people use, why was Ned Dane named after Ned? It's a very honorable thing, and I think the idea would be that Arthur Dane, this is the thing I've always gone with, is that Arthur Dane is this character that I probably think dishonorably died. And Ned is very honorable in the way that he takes responsibility for this. He takes accountability. He takes the sword back to Starfall. He was someone that I think the Danes respected quite a lot. And I think it makes sense as to why they would have done that. Also, if he did have some love for Ashara, but he just couldn't do that, and maybe he was somebody that was trying to console Ashara, because again, Ashara loses a ton in her life, that I think it makes sense why she would want to take her life, and that's a tough subject to handle, but think about what Ashara loses in the war, right? She loses probably her best friend Elia, she loses her brother, she loses a lot of the people she knew during this time period. I think it makes a lot of sense. So that's the one thing. So again, we move on to the last one, which is dance. Now, dance, really the only idea we get here is that Ned and Ashara probably were in love, or they did like each other to some degree, or at least Ned did, because Barristan kind of recounts how Ned danced with her. That's really all we get, though. There isn't anything more. And Order of the Green Hand, through 2 parts, hasn't even cited that source, so I guess it's not a big one for Ashara. But it's something that I did want to recount. And another thing that's brought up, so when we get the Night of the Laughing Tree story from Mira, it's not said that Ashara and Ned were in love or anything even like that. It's more like it just recounts that they danced and or met. So again, there wasn't really a lot there for me. So again, my big point here with telling you guys all of those sources and all of those is kind of discounting what they actually mean for the story. Also looking at the credibility of those sources that we see and why I tend to not believe them too much. Even if we look at Cersei as a character, she is someone that tends to not be the most credible source. She is someone that, for instance, thinks that like other people are always the problem and not her. She is someone that I don't tend to believe. Catelyn is another character that's motivated a lot by emotion. She is not someone I take as a credible source. Ned Dane is a young kid, basically, and Barristan gets love stuff wrong all of the time. When we look at how Barristan views love, he recounts a lot of things, like, for instance, Shiera Seastar being this person that is in between Bittersteel and Bloodraven, and that's one of the biggest reasons what started the Blackfire Rebellions, which is just not true at all, or is heavily exaggerated. Something that I think is very interesting, because I've been watching a lot of History of Westeros, and they do a fantastic job of exploring that exact idea that I bring up. But again, we see that none of these sources really have any insider knowledge that would make them a very credible source. All of these sources all they're really telling us is that Ned and Ashara probably maybe had some little relationship, maybe. We just don't know. Now, I think this is the most damning evidence for Ned and Ashara, because Ned and Ashara supporters like to bring up this idea that, well, why is there this line that Ned never thinks of Rhaegar, or hasn't thought of him in years. And I've said many times, that's a plot hole. But if we even want to flip that on its head, Ned, throughout the entire book 1, does not think of Ashara a single time. Not a single time. Even when Jon is being brought up, even when Cersei says Ashara, even in Ned seems like his final moments, he doesn't really think of Ashara. Why is that? If Ashara was this person that was Ned's first wife, he had a child with her, she was someone that he was in love with, why is she never brought up? It's very interesting. But then we're going to use this idea that Rhaegar has not been thought about in years, which is just a plot hole. I mean, we've talked about this so many times throughout, is that there's no way Ned could think about Robert's Rebellion or his sister, who he thinks about a lot, and never think about Rhaegar. That line doesn't make any sense to me. But the idea that Ned never thinks of Ashara a single time throughout the entire book, and it's not like a line where Ned says it, we're in Ned's POV. He is not one of the sources that mentions Ashara. Why is that? I have no answer for that. I haven't really ever seen anyone, or that's a Ned and Ashara supporter, give me any good evidence for that. If you guys would like to give evidence for that and try to tell me why you think you believe that, please let me know. Because I don't know what the counter argument to is that. Maybe it's the idea that George doesn't want to spoil it or anything like that, but Ned can think about Ashara and not spoil who Jon's parents are. I don't know. I think that's very odd, because Ned thinks about Lyanna quite often. And it doesn't spoil Jon's parentage, in my opinion, because there is stuff that you have to dig deeper into. Now, I am someone that specifically thinks that this theory is a red herring. It's the first thing we hear about Jon's parentage. Again, it's rumors. It's something that George puts into our heads from the beginning. And does that sound like how George does his writing? When we hear plans like Littlefinger's, like, say, Varys, or any of these plans that are made out loud, do they ever work? When Robb is saying, oh, we're going to go take back the North, does that work? Do these plans ever happen? I just think, to me, this theory is a red herring. Just to kind of pull that attention away maybe from who his actual parents are. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to mention. Now, again, I think this theory goes away from Ned's character. I think Ned is propped up as this character that is a very honorable person. He is someone that I just could not see making the same mistakes as maybe Robb. Because Robb is in a much vastly different situation. Robb, when he has his thing with Jane, Robb is injured. His war efforts aren't looking the best, right? Like, yes, he has invaded the West, and he is, making some progress. He hasn't lost any battles, but he's still outnumbered. And also, when we see what's going to happen with the Tyrells and the Lannisters coming together, the war is not looking good for Robb. Robb is also extremely injured. He's not in a good and healthy state. And he also has this not great prospect of marrying a Frey, and I think all of this gets to Robb. Robb is also younger than Ned is at that point, when we would think Ned possibly hooked up with Ashara. Ned is in a vastly different situation, in my opinion. And again, Ned does have kind of the stresses of war starting and all this, but we're kind of led to believe that Ned starts this relationship with Ashara and all of this going on even before the war breaks out. And you're telling me that Ned never approached his father about marrying Ashara, or there was no agreement there, there's nothing that ever gets out, Varys doesn't find out about any of this information. It just, to me, there's a lot of holes there. And then you have to also bring up this idea that Ned eventually marries Catelyn. Ned would not marry Catelyn if he was then married to Ashara. Or did Ned annul that marriage to Ashara because he knew he was going to have to marry somebody else? There's too many contrivances, in my opinion, that go against Ned as a character, when simply we can do Ned's character much differently and better. When we look at R+L, this idea that Ned's one big dishonorable action, the one thing that has smeared Ned's character, is actually not a smear. It's Ned's biggest achievement. He was able to keep his sister's son alive this long and keep his identity a secret so that he could protect him. And he took that all to hit his own legacy, his own person who he is. I think that's much more compelling writing than having to go and jump through all of these hoops for Ned and Ashara. So that's that point. So moving on, we also have the idea that Ned and Jon look alike. So again, I'm going to defeat this much better than I think I did in the Order of the Green Hand reaction. I sometimes when I'm reacting, I just don't have my best arguments, but let's look at this. So Jon looks exactly like Ned. Okay, fair enough. So that means that Jon cannot be a Targaryen. That is the Ned and Ashara usual argument. Okay, well, Robb, Bran, Sansa, and Rickon all pretty much look exactly like Tullys. They look like Catelyn. They don't really have any Stark in them. Does that make those kids not Neds? If we want to go a step further, Arya is constantly compared to looking like Lyanna. Well, does that mean Arya is Lyanna's child? Or is it obvious that Arya got Lyanna's looks and stuff through Ned? Is it not possible that we could use the exact same idea that Lyanna, who is related to Ned, had a child and her child looked like her brother? I am somebody, if you want to use real life examples, I am someone that looks a lot more like my aunt than I do my mom. My mom has more of a brownish hair while my aunt has black hair. I have more of a skin tone that is accustomed to my cousin and my aunt's child than I do, say, my dad, who is very, very pale and burns easily while I don't. Genetics are not as simple as just saying, oh, Jon doesn't look like the Targaryens. Because if we want to apply that, it's a double standard, right? That contradicts your own argument. Jon doesn't look like a Dane either. He doesn't have the purple eyes. He doesn't, even if we want to go even a step further, Jon is not this great swordsman like Arthur Dane. He's just not. Or even Darkstar. If we want to go that far, the Darkstar is said to be one of the most dangerous fighters in Westeros. Jon isn't that. Jon is good, but he isn't that. So again, I think that's a very flimsy argument as well, because either way you go with Jon's parentage, Jon doesn't look like Ashara or Rhaegar. Now, the next idea is, why hide Ashara as Jon's mother? Why? So the point some people have maybe put here is, well, there was a baby swap, or there was something like Jon was swapped for this person or that, and that Rhaegar and Lyanna's child, for instance, could have been Dany, or it could have been young Griff. And again, I think this is very far-fetched, because why would Ned trust say, a Varys or a Lyria with Lyanna's child, instead of just taking the child to Greywater Keep? It doesn't make any sense to me. All of the leading theories that I think make the most sense of where Ashara is, that she's with Howland Reed. So why wouldn't you apply the same logic here? If that was the truth, why wouldn't they actually hide her? For instance, Dany is a character that's not hidden at all. You're really going to tell me that you believe that Ned hid Dany, because apparently Dany is Rhaegar and Lyanna's child, and he hid her with just basically making her an open target in Essos, and Robert thought about trying to kill her multiple times? Doesn't seem likely. Now, we know that in this theory, people also believe that she was at first hidden in Dorne. I don't agree. I think young Griff is another character where I just don't agree with the idea that Ned is willing to trust a character like Illyrio or Varys over someone like Howland Reed, who quite possibly could be hiding Ashara as well. Right? It doesn't add up to me. And I'm going to give you guys evidence as well on why it makes more sense that Rhaegar and Lyanna's child is Jon. There's a very specific Dany prophecy to me that really confirms it, but we're not going to talk about that as of yet. Now, my next problem is, why is Ashara a minor character? Ashara is a character that, again, I was able to tell you guys every reference of Ashara within the first 10 minutes of this video. If I went through every single time that, say, Lyanna is brought up or Rhaegar is brought up, this video would be 2 hours long. So why am I supposed to believe that George has made Ashara Jon's mother when Ashara is a character that I'd say a casual viewer, again, we are not, if you're watching this video, you're not casual, you're in-depth looking up Song of Ice and Fire content on YouTube, which makes you more than a casual viewer. Do not care about Ashara Dayne. The Danes in and of themselves, as of right now, maybe they're not, I wouldn't say they're a minor house, but when it comes to like popularity, as in people knowing them, they're not a popular house. They don't add a lot to the story, in my opinion, as of right now. I just don't think this is a makes sense idea. Why is then, if Ashara is such a massive character, is she not even in Game of Thrones, the show? And I guess that's going to get into another point we're going to get on to. It's coming. I know you guys are waiting for the massive point in my R+L points, but George helped write the first season. Ashara is nowhere to be found. She's nowhere to be found. There's not a mention of Ashara, not in a shot in the dark, nothing. Ashara is not a character that is, like, on that level to be this big reveal of Jon's parentage. I'm sorry. That's how I look at it. So then we get this another idea that Order of the Green Hand did mention, and it's something I see a lot, is that I don't know if this is George's wife or his girlfriend. I've heard both, but either way, she mentioned that R+L is too simple, so that, maybe isn't it or whatever. But again, Ashara Dayne and Ned is the one we're told in the story. Is that not even more simple? Some people have said, well, it's not George's way of going about making this hero character in Jon, being a Targaryen and a Stark. But then I'm also supposed to just not even look at the fact that everyone that believes, usually, that Ned and Ashara are Jon's parents, is now that Jon is this hero character who's going to wield Dawn, and he's Azor Ahai. Is that not the same thing, if not even more, into that hero trope for Jon? I don't know. I find that a very inconsistent quote with what the alternative is. And that kind of wraps up most of my N+A argument here. Those are some of the main counter-argument points I've heard of. Some of the other ones that I would throw in here would be the comparison of, say, Jon's personality to Ned, which to me is a very weird evidence to cite. Just looking at the idea that Ned was basically Jon's only parent, and that was who was teaching him and helping him grow up. We're going to read a quote later on about how Ned wanted Jon and Robb to grow up. Again, that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me evidence-wise. If we look at another piece of evidence, N+A supporters will cite is the idea that Ghost is this character, or there's not this character, is this wolf that is very separate from the other children and their wolves. And I would say simply that, yeah, that's evidence for, any theory, really, that you want to see on Jon's parentage, because Ghost is inherently different. Jon is different. Regardless if Jon is actually a half-brother to them or not, I think it makes more sense that Jon is something completely different. He's still a Stark, but he's not. He's not of Ned. So it makes more sense that this other wolf will be off to the side. Also, just a little wink to some of the Targaryens. We see that Ghost has red eyes and is very white. Something very similar to, say, Bloodraven. And I think Bloodraven was heavily involved in the reason that Jon could find Ghost in the first place. And red eyes tends to be kind of, or red, the color, I should say, is more of a Targaryen color as well. So that would be my counter argument to that as well. So moving on to more of my R+L equals J points. We're going to be citing some evidence here. We're going to be using outside sources. So let's look at the first one. Now, I have had people argue this in the comments, that people said that George could have just basically allowed D&D to do it regardless of what they said, or D&D changed it later on. But this is my biggest counter argument to how that's going to go. George R. R. Martin at the end of season 8, again, this is after George R. R. Martin wasn't happy with the direction of Game of Thrones. He had some gripes with them. he still congratulates them on the end of the show, and he specifically says a quote that I'm going to bring up on screen right now. Again, so this quote and or passage from the Nada blog was uploaded on May 20th, 2019. That is the day after the broadcasting of the final episode, The Iron Throne of A Game of Thrones. And this is the bigger quote. The last night, the last show. After 8 epic seasons, HBO's Game of Thrones series has come to an end. It's hard to believe it's over, if truth be told. The years have gone past in the blink of an eye. Can it really have been more than a decade since my manager, Vince Geratis, set up a meeting in the Palm in LA? And I sat down for the first time with David Benioff and DB Weiss for a lunch that lasted well past dinner. I asked them if they knew who Jon Snow's mother was. Fortunately, they did. Again, why would, right after the show is concluded, after we find out who Jon's parents are, would then George say, they did? Now, the argument here would be, well, they could have changed it, which I find is a very poor argument, just based on the fact that in season 1, which George was heavily involved in, he helped write a lot of the episodes in that early part, was Ashara never mentioned. There was many times that he could have fit it in, especially if George was under the idea that they answered Ashara. Well, that never happened. So, if George is saying that they answered correctly, and he has said this multiple times, I'm not cherry picking, this is just the moment that I think is the most obvious that they were right and they did it correctly on the show. Maybe it's going to be slightly different the way it's revealed, which definitely will be, and there will be different circumstances to it, but that plot point is confirmed. George says it right here. I don't know how much more evidence you need to cite, and that's the thing, is that if you're going to cite any evidence outside of the book, you can't ignore this. Like, you have to give me some argument here. And people will always argue that maybe they just changed it, which doesn't really make any sense to me. Why would they tell George one thing, then write a completely different thing, in which George was also helping them write it? Especially early on. Now, not later in the, later on, but at the very beginning, he was helping them get this show kickstarted. I just don't know how you refute that evidence. So that is kind of some of the evidence I wanted to cite here as well. So let's go back to my points. That, I think, is a jarring one, and I wanted to start out with that. So again, I've talked about this already with the M+A thing, but it's something that's relevant to mention in the R+L section as well. Ned calls Jon his blood in private to Catelyn, but his son in public. Very different. Also, we see the 2 different time points. Ned has basically thought of Jon as a son for a while now, right? Jon is kind of growing up at this point, and when we see Ned call Jon his blood, that's when Ned and Catelyn are still very early on in their relationship, where Ned has not really processed Jon as a son for a while. Or Ned has not processed Jon being his son yet. Now, let's also look at the idea of Lyanna promising Ned to do something. And only when Ned gave her his word would she basically stop. What would Ned have to promise Lyanna? What was so important? And I think everyone, even if you're an N+A, agrees that there was some birthing here that went on. And what I'm going to basically say for the rest of this theory is why it makes the most sense that it's Jon. And let's go to this idea here. Blue winter roses are associated with Lyanna's death. We have multiple different sources that I'm going to point that out right now. So the first one being that Lyanna was crowned with a crown with white or blue-white flowers at Harrenhal for being the queen of love and beauty. Next, Robert then also says that she always had liked flowers, another wink to that. Theon also has a prophetic dream that Lyanna is wearing a crown of blue-white roses while her gown is stained with gore and blood. Again, a nod at that idea of her death and what Lyanna liked, and the crown being the one she got at Harrenhal. During a fever dream about the combat at the Tower of Joy, Ned also dreams of a storm of rose petals blowing across a blood-streaked sky, as blue as the eye of death, while hearing Lyanna call out to him. Again, the idea of Lyanna being these rose petals or these flowers, and also dying. in this and having that blood. And again, as she is dying, rose petals spill from Lyanna's hand, dead and black. Again, connecting the idea of flowers and Lyanna. And again, something I also want to note while we're going through this section, when Ned is dreaming about Lyanna in just the Tower of Joy, Ashara is not mentioned a single time in any of this. So again, that's something else that's very important when we're looking at this baby that is so pivotal to everything. Now, again, while in captivity, Ned dreams of Lyanna's statue in the crypts of Winterfell, where she is wearing a garland of pale blue roses while weeping blood. Again, the idea that Lyanna was dying of childbirth, but she also was this blue roses. She was these flowers. And that all brings us to the most important quote that ties all of this together very nicely, in my opinion. At the House of the Undying, Daenerys sees a vision of a blue flower growing in a wall of ice. And this, in my opinion, would symbolize Jon Snow, who is the child of Lyanna, and he is growing in basically his role as a Night's Watchman and as a man. Again, more evidence citing that Jon is this character that is Lyanna's son. We also see another vision with Bran. Bran sees a vision of his father, much younger than he had ever known him, praying in front of the weirwood tree in Winterfell's Godswood, saying, "Let them grow up close as brothers, with only love between them, and let my lady wife find it in her heart to forgive." Ned, I would assume, would be talking about this probably very soon after Robert's Rebellion. But why would he say, "Let them grow up close as brothers," citing that they're not brothers? Even if, you would look at Jon saying he's a half-brother, Jon would still be looped into that, but he is not a brother. That's why he's saying close as brothers. Not that this Jon is not Ned's son. Again, very interesting. And also the idea of Catelyn's forgiveness. What would that mean? Well, Ned's going to be lying to her. He can't really tell her the truth because, one, Catelyn's kind of a blabbermouth. Catelyn, would she be able to keep this secret? Who knows? Now, let's also look at the events of Book 1 when it comes to Robert coming to Winterfell. Jon is purposely hid from Robert. Now, this is prompted by Catelyn, thinking that Jon shouldn't be at the table. He's a bastard. He shouldn't be with the royal family. But Ned allows this. And we know that Ned treats Jon really well and doesn't want him to be isolated. But he allows it in this moment. And why is that? Because if Robert found out that Jon was a Targaryen, what would he do? We think multiple times where Ned is so angry, it's the thing that divides them constantly. Let's think about the first time Ned and Robert have a massive fallout, is when Robert is okay with the killing of Rhaegar's children. Interesting. And then we see their next fallout is the idea of Robert trying to kill Dany, who is pregnant. Well, there's a lot of symbolism there. Lyanna was pregnant and died. And also, she has an innocent child that Robert wants to kill. Jon. Could that be Jon? Looking at it from Lyanna, why Ned needed to hide Jon. And that's one of those things where you look at Robert, and one of the things that Jon was not able to quench was Robert and his hatred for the Targaryens. All of this builds up to this fact that Ned knows what Robert would do. I think all of the pieces fit perfectly as to why Jon is being hidden, why Jon is this character that so much emphasis is put on by George. And we have all the necessary foreshadowing through visions that we've needed. When, claims are made by Order of the Green Hand that there's no evidence to cite this, I gave you an entire list of things out of the book, and there's even more that I left out. One of my main sources for this video, especially for the R+L evidence, is I used the World of Ice and Fire wiki that I think pretty much everyone uses. And I went through, there's a giant list of evidence you can cite for Rhaegar and Lyanna. I probably didn't even use 40 to 30% of the quotes and evidence I could have used, but I thought this was enough to really prove my point. I don't need to constantly go through every single quote on the idea of this flower of Lyanna and why that is so important for Daenerys' vision that she gets at the House of the Undying. There's other things referring to Robert and why it makes so much sense that Jon is a Targaryen. There's so many things that go into this, and when people use this argument that, oh, there's more book evidence for Jon being a Dane, that's just not true. I went through in this video and went through every single Ashara Dane quote that would maybe imply that Jon is her son, and it doesn't seem to add up. There isn't enough there. It seems very much a red herring. That's something that, like, George kind of maybe reminds us every once in a while. Let's not forget, Ashara isn't in 2 of the 5 books. Lyanna is in every book. Rhaegar is listed in every book. Their significance is much higher. And let's not even forget the main theme of and the title of the story, A Song of Ice and Fire. How poetic is that if Jon is a Stark of ice and he has the Targaryen fire? And sometimes the most obvious theory is not bad. It's because it fits perfectly. It's because everything makes so much sense that should be the theory. And I am of the notion that even if, say, it comes out that it was Ned and Ashara that is the parents of Jon, which I find highly unlikely, I would say it's probably like 90% R plus L, maybe even more, I would probably look back on it and think, wow, it would have to depend how George did the other side of that, where, like, who is Lyanna's child and how he explains it, but I would feel like he missed an opportunity. I don't know, there's just way more significance. There's way more you can do with Jon's character if he's a Targaryen and a Stark, like, mix. Think about the idea of, oh, Jon gets revealed as being Ashara and Ned's son. What does that do for Jon? Like, what does that do for his character arc? It doesn't do much for me. Jon already had the opportunities to be full-fledged Stark. That was already something that could have happened if he had gone with Stannis. It's something that's already, if you believe that Rob's will had Jon being his heir and legitimized as a Stark, Ned and Ashara is kind of a hollow reveal. It doesn't really do much. But the idea that Rhaegar and Lyanna are his parents creates massive things that are very interesting. Look at when it was revealed on the show. Everybody had these massive expectations for what that was going to be. How would that operate with Jon and Dany's relationship? How would that change Jon as a character? They didn't really do a good job of it in the show, but the writing possibilities, the things you could build upon in that story for Jon are limitless. And that's what I think is so interesting about when we eventually get that reveal. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I didn't actually tend to be, or have it be this long. I didn't think it was going to be this long, but there's just a lot I had to talk about with this theory, and I could have even talked about more. There's just so much you can go into, whether it's counter arguments to N plus A, whether that's supporting more evidence for R plus L. There's so much you can do with this theory. It's one of those theories that I really concretely believe in. I'd say this is my second favorite theory is R plus L. I know it's a basic theory, but it's one that I just think fits the story perfectly. My favorite theory will always be Maester Conspiracy. I just think it's such a fun theory because of just looking back at so many different events throughout history. But thank you guys all for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the extra video this week. It's just a video that I felt was necessary based upon kind of the content I've been doing recently, just to do a revamped version of this, give a better explanation as to my thoughts on this topic. And I hope you guys all enjoyed. So I'll see you guys all in the next video, and I hope you guys all enjoyed. Bye, guys.